So as you know, in this class, we've been taking a regional approach to Christianity worldwide. So we've talked about Christianity in Asia, Latin America, Africa. Last week we did the United States, and this week we're doing Europe. So we're going to talk about what Christianity in Europe looks like, what have been the changes in Christianity in Europe over the last 100 years, and what are some of the challenges that are facing Christianity in Europe today. Now, church-state in Europe is historically a very complicated issue. So the separation of church and state as we know it in the United States is actually a relatively new concept to Europe. And so the whole affiliation and church and state connection is kind of a thread that runs throughout our discussion of Europe today. So here's where we're going in discussing Christianity in Europe. We're going to talk about this big bad word, secularization theory. We hear this word thrown around a lot. What does it really mean? We're going to look at three hypotheses related to secularization: the differentiation hypothesis, the decline hypothesis, the privatization hypothesis. And then we're going to answer this really important question related to Christianity and Europe. Was Europe ever actually Christianized? This is a debate that happens within the history of Christianity. Then we'll talk about the exceptions to European secularization, changes in Christianity in Europe, and then Muslims in Europe, which is a huge topic that lots of people are talking about now. So here's our outline of where we're going. So the story of Christianity is told through the lens of secularization theory, and as we can see just from this, there are so many different ways of understanding secularization. And when you're in a conversation with someone, or you're reading and you see secularization theory come up in literature, you really want to ask yourself, what exactly are they talking about? Because there's so many ways to understand it. So we're going to define secularization in a few ways. The differentiation hypothesis is from a sociologist of religion whose name is Jose Casanova. Now I have these two pictures up here that I took myself. Here's the Dublin Tourist Centre in the middle of Dublin, Ireland. And here's a picture of the Edinburgh Tourist Centre right in the middle of downtown Edinburgh. What do you notice about these tourist centres?
They look like churches.
They look like churches because they were churches. So there's these big, beautiful, Gothic-looking churches in the middle of these major European cities that no longer host worship services, now host cafes, and they have guides for how to take bus tours throughout the city, and they're totally secular buildings now. And so this is a little bit symbolic of the differentiation hypothesis. So this hypothesis says that religion is no longer the most single and pervasive organizing structure of society. So if you think about it, in Europe, church and state were married. And so religion was intertwined in politics and culture and society. So religion was sown throughout every aspect of European society. But in the differentiation hypothesis, church and state are different. That's why it's differentiation. So religion has become, or is becoming, one of many specialized, what Jose Casanova calls, social subsystems. So each has their own place in society. Religion has a place in society. Politics has a place in society. Economics has a place in society. And religion is on equal grounds to all the other subsections of society. It doesn't have a place of prominence anymore. And so with the disestablishment of churches, you get what we call now in the USA that we know and love, the separation of church and state. Now, some countries in Europe disestablished quite a long time ago, like France and some others in Western Europe, but others it's actually quite new. Here are some countries that in Europe that technically still have state church. So the United Kingdom, we just heard Titus Pressler talk about how the Church of England is still the state church of the UK. Several tiny countries, Malta, Monaco, Liechtenstein, and the Holy See, of course, has a state church. The Holy See is a church. Are Roman Catholic. Greece is still an Orthodox country. Denmark and Iceland are Lutheran countries. And here's, I just put her up, Queen Elizabeth II, right, the Queen of the UK. Her title is the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, which is kind of an odd title. Maybe you've never heard of that before. It's really just a ceremonial or a symbolic title at this point, but I think there's still something to be said for the fact that the United Kingdom still has an established church and there's still a queen of it who's involved in church relations in some way. So they're not officially disaffiliated or differentiated. There's still a really strong relationship there. Here's an example of the differentiation hypothesis. So these are some, I love pictures of Norwegian churches. They're always so beautiful and picturesque, right? They're just a church and a beautiful landscape. So Norway's Lutheran Church just disestablished formally on January 1st of this year. So this is pretty recent news. As of January 1st, the Church of Norway and the Norwegian government formally divorced after 500 years together. This is how it was told in the news. The government and the church got a divorce after 500 years. Now, Norway had over 1,200 priests and bishops, and they used to be government employees. So now think of your churches here. Think of your priest or your pastor or your bishop. Now think of your priest, pastor, and bishop as not just a religious vocation, but a government official. That kind of blows our minds as Americans a little bit, right? We don't tend to think of your priest also being a government official. But that was the case in Norway. They were appointed by the king. So now the Church of Norway is no longer an agency of the state, but it's an independent business. So there's been some commentary that yes, this has occurred, but there have also been statements that the Evangelical Lutheran Church will still be Norway's national church and will still be supported as such by the state. So maybe it's not so much a divorce, but maybe just a separation. So we're not quite sure where this is going to go. But the point is 500 years of establishment now is being challenged a little bit. So that's the first hypothesis, the differentiation hypothesis. The second is the decline hypothesis. So in the decline hypothesis, we're talking about really individual decline of personal religiosity. So in Europe, people are practicing religion less and less. People are less likely to self-identify as religious. They're less likely to participate in religious rituals. You know, we have in Western Europe, this is particularly the case, that France is now a post-Catholic country. Spain is becoming rapidly more secular. Even in Italy, where Roman Catholicism is still quite strong, people are practicing religion less. And these are all examples of the decline hypothesis. So I have a few maps, because we love data in this class, a few maps from the European Values Study. And so here's a map talking about the importance of God. And there's two variables on this map. I know it's a little bit hard to see. This lecture is also on Blackboard, so you can access it there. So the little bars here are asking people if they believe in a personal God. So the taller the bar, the more people believe in a personal God. And the smaller the bar on the right, they're atheists. They don't believe there is a personal God. And then the darker the purple is the places where people say that God is important. So Turkey, Romania, Poland, Portugal, Italy, these are darker purple countries with high belief in a personal God. But what's more interesting is that there are places where people don't attend religious services but still believe in a personal God. This is kind of the unaffiliated category that we talked about in the United States. You don't have to go to church to necessarily be called a Christian. So that's happening in Europe too. Here's another map of religious service attendance. So a lot of sociologists and theologians and all kinds of people see religious service attendance as a really good indicator of how religious people are, which makes sense. If you're committed enough to get up and go to church every week or every month, then there's some kind of connection or commitment there. So again, the higher the bar, the more frequently people attend church. And then the darker the color, is places where the percentage of people who attend religious services at least once a month. So Poland is always the outlier when we're talking about religion in Europe. There's a very special Catholic Church state relationship in Poland that people have maintained Polish identity. It's an outlier. Ireland also is the case there. But we're seeing a similar pattern here of people who go to church and the percentage of people who attend religious services. But you can see, if we were to take the same survey 100 years ago, what do you think it would look like?
A lot of purple.
There'd be a lot of purple. There'd be a lot of people going to church at least once a month. They'd probably be going every day. So I wish we had that data from 100 years ago. We don't, unfortunately. But it shows the decline hypothesis that this map would be totally purple 100 years ago. But now we're seeing outliers. It's only outliers who are the ones who go to church and believe in a personal God. And then one final one. Here's the answer to the question, do you consider yourself a religious person? This is another way that sociologists get at religious identity and affiliation. Are you a religious person? So the places where people most identified as religious were Poland, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Portugal. Those are the countries up here. And then the places where people self-identified as least religious, Belarus, Sweden, the UK, Estonia, and the Czech Republic, which are these down here. That's Belarus all the way down there, former communist country. So the purple is a religious person, not a religious person, a convinced atheist. Now what do you notice about the convinced atheist piece? It's pretty small comparatively. So people love to talk about how religion is dying in Europe, but it's not quite the hardcore atheism that people like to depict it as. They're not identifying as atheist. Most of them are identifying as something in between. I'm not a religious person, but maybe there's still a little bit more of the story there. So not a lot of very convinced atheists here. It's hard to be an atheist, I think. Okay, so then we have the differentiation hypothesis, we have the decline hypothesis, and then the third one is the privatization hypothesis, which is like this meme, hey, I found your nose, it was in my business again. Okay. That pretty much sums up the privatization hypothesis, and it's the one that I think Americans like the most. So this hypothesis says that religion is a private affair. It is not any of your business whether I go to church or what I believe or whom I worship or how often I pray. This is kind of the American way. We don't want anyone to tell us what to do or what to think or how to be. We want to just do religion on our own. It's a little bit like the spiritual but not religious that we talked about last week. And also in this hypothesis, it's becoming difficult, like in the American scenario, to separate religious and non-religious identity. If you don't go to church, you're not part of a Christian community, religious identity changes. The definition of identity changes. But also in the privatization hypothesis, religious ideas and beliefs are becoming marginalized in public life. This is maybe the one in an American context that we're the most familiar with. But even though it might feel familiar to us, there's different ways of thinking about religion becoming private. So here's two hypotheses set forth by sociologist of religion Grace Davie. Now if you're interested in religion in Europe, in particular in Britain, she is a British sociologist. I highly recommend reading the books of Grace Davie. So she has come up with two theories regarding the privatization hypothesis. The first is believing without belonging. Has anyone heard this phrase before? Yeah, most people have heard this. This is very popular from Grace Davie. Just the idea that you don't have to go to a church to be a Christian. And perhaps no one said it best than Justin Bieber, of all people, said last year, you don't need to go to church to be a Christian. If you go to Taco Bell, that doesn't make you a taco. So here's Sociology of Religion from Justin Bieber. And the quote here says, Justin Bieber on being a Christian. These are his grand thoughts on being a Christian.
He's a believer.
He's a believer, but not a taco. So the idea is that I can believe what I want without the church telling me what to believe. I can believe in God, but I don't have to believe in a specific God that someone tells me to believe in. I can believe in a spiritual dimension, but not necessarily the Christian spiritual dimension. I believe, but I don't have to belong in the way that anyone tells me to belong. It's very much the gray area that exists in religious belief and identity. So this was Grace Davies, minus the Bieber, this was Grace Davies' first idea about how religion in Europe is changing. A few years later, she came out with this theory called vicarious religion. Has anyone heard of this one? Yeah, this one is more recent, but far less popular in the American context because it's totally foreign to us. We don't have a concept of vicarious religion in the United States culture in the way that Europeans do. So let me tell you how vicarious religion works. So let's pretend we're the United Kingdom, this room here, all of us, and we're Anglicans, because it's the United Kingdom. And Anya and Will go to church every week. They got married in the church, they baptize their babies in the church, they take communion every week, they do all the things that they're supposed to do, but the rest of us don't. And we don't have to because Will and Anya are. We experience religion vicariously through them. So thank you, Will and Anya. I don't have to go to church on Sundays because they have it covered. So the majority believes that the minority who are actually participating and attending and praying, they kind of cover us in some way. And the reason why this works in a European setting is because of this historical relationship between church and state. There was much more of a communal way of understanding Christianity than we ever had in the American setting. Yeah?
And that is across Europe pretty broadly, that notion?
That's a great question. I think Grace Davy would probably say more so in the British context. That's probably the one she's most familiar with. But I'm willing to bet it's found in other places as well. Maybe especially among more liturgical traditions. Because it's said, right? It's set in Anglicanism and in Catholicism. The liturgy is the same everywhere. And you just get the sense that someone somewhere is practicing it, and I'm included in that because of my heritage, because of my past, because of my country, because of my ethnicity, whatever it is. So this is unique to the European context, I think, because historic churches, even if you might not attend them, they still have a very prominent place in particular parts of your life. So a lot of Europeans, they're still baptized in the churches, in Anglican and Catholic churches. They probably will still get married. They might still have, funerals in these churches because that is just what you do if you are from these places. And that's regardless of whether or not you believe it, regardless of whether or not you identify as a Christian. So in this way, religion is kind of replaced by spirituality. It's better to sit in a boat thinking about God than to sit in a church thinking about fishing. This is private religion. Why go to church if you're only going to think about fishing? Isn't the point to think about God? So why not do the thing that encourages me to think about God? And maybe I think about God best knowing that Will and Anya are receiving the sacraments on my behalf. So it's kind of unusual to think of it this way in an American setting, but in a European setting it actually makes a lot of sense. And that's why most of you have heard about believing without belonging, but none of you heard about vicarious religion, because these ideas of hers, only the ones that make sense in our context, really got exported here. Now, another historian slash theologian wrote about this belief in belonging issue. Her name is Diana Butler Bass. Has anyone heard of her? Yeah, she's a popular writer of American religious history. And she came up with the 3 B's of religion. What do you think the 3 B's are? 2 of them are on the screen, so that's not, yeah, Chris.
The third one's behaving.
Okay, good. So she identified the 3 B's in order of importance as belief, behavior, and then belonging.
What was her name again?
Diana Butler Bass, B-A-S-S.
Thank you.
And so she writes an analysis of how throughout American religious history, I'm going a little bit American right now, just it's related, that what was always most important is what you believed. You got to make sure your theology is right. You got to make sure your belief is right. You got to believe the right thing. And then your belief will influence your behavior. If you have the right belief, then you'll have the right behavior. And if you're doing these things right, you're going to belong to the right place, which is the church. So if you have the right belief, the right will lead to the right behavior, you'll be belonging to the right community, which is the church. So historically, this has always been the case in American religious history. Now, as we've seen, the 20th century was quite tumultuous, a lot of social, political, global, and local change. So she and Grace Davy think that maybe two of these have swapped. Which one do you think is more important now?
Behavior?
No, belonging and belief have flipped.
There you go. Belonging and belief have flipped. So now what's more important is that you hang with the right people.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily have to be church people. You just have to be in the right community. Belonging is so important for us now because everything is becoming individualized. Everything is privatized. So you have to, and because humans crave communal life in some way, you really have to find the place where you belong. And if you belong to the right people, you'll behave in the right way.
Yeah.
And then maybe your beliefs will align.
Yeah.
Belief isn't as important anymore.
Yeah.
So this is a pretty substantial shift in both American and European religion. You want to say something?
Well, I was going to say, I remember taking a church history class where this view was put forward, and then he also articulated a so this what you have on the board is modernism. The belonging belief flip is postmodernism, but then the ancient church was behavior first. So it was behavior, belonging, belief.
Yeah.
Was what the ancient church did in like catechisms and
Right.
through catechesis, and you had to prove that you could do the right things before they would let you take communion and things like that. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
But this is somewhat of a Protestant way of looking
Exactly.
at it because Diana Biller Babs was writing about American religious
Right.
history and so on. But yeah, that's a good point that different traditions are going to emphasize different
Yeah.
B's.
Yeah.
But over the 20th century, we've seen the B's being all mixed up. It's all getting mixed up now. Any questions about the three hypotheses related to secularization before we move on? No? Okay. Okay, this is a huge question that cannot be answered in the time that we have together tonight. Was Europe ever Christian? Why do you think we talk about this question in relation to secularization theory? So if Europe, that's Europe, is Christian, and we're talking about a 20th century decline of Christianity, people want to know where we started from. So if this is today, and we're analyzing where European Christianity is today, how do we know there's been a decline unless we know where we started? And so if we're going to start at the beginning of the 20th century, well, why not the 19th, or the 18th, or the 6th? So that's how we ended up with the question of, was Europe ever Christian? And a lot of people conclude maybe not, which is actually quite controversial considering Europe was the center of Christendom for so many centuries. So this is a very controversial question. So a lot of scholars have argued that maybe Europe wasn't really that Christian to begin with. So what we're calling secularization now is really just a facade. Maybe this is just what Europe always was. The Christianity that triumphed over Rome, they say, was a mass social movement. Maybe not necessarily a religious movement, but a social and political movement in a highly competitive environment. That is, Christianity just beat out all the other competing worldviews. For many reasons. Christians took care of the sick better, they raised the prominence of women, Christians married later, they had negative views of abortion, they had higher birth rates, so really social and even demographic reasons why Christianity prevailed over what they call barbarian Europe. There's a book by Richard Fletcher called The Barbarian Conversion, which is a huge tome about how Europe became Christian. And so the argument goes that Europe was really only nominally converted. Kings were converted, and then they extended their conversion to their subjects. So it was the conversion of the masses was really a secondary, more passive kind of conversion. And then we can ask ourselves in retrospect, is that authentic conversion or not? So I'm going to tell you a brief story about how this went down in our favorite country for today of Norway. So let's look at the Christianization of Norway. Olaf Tryggvason was an English-educated Christian convert, and he seized the throne of Norway in the year 995, where he attempted to convert the country by force. He killed people who resisted conversion, and he burned their estates. This is like real Christian piety, right? These and other repressive measures aroused sufficient opposition to defeat him in the Battle of Svolder, about the year 1000, pictured there, during which he died. 15 years later, Olaf Haraldsson, who had been baptized in France, conquered Norway, and he too used fire and sword in an effort to compel Christianization. Look at that language, compel Christianization. And he too provoked widespread hatred, leading to rebellion, and he was forced into exile. When he attempted to return, leading a new army that he had risen out of Kiev, he was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stilkestad in 1030, pictured there. Despite this, he was canonized as Saint Olaf and is credited with the Christianization of Norway, which seems to have consisted primarily of the reimposition of Olaf's official policies of intolerance. Now, knowing what we know about the history of Christian mission, what kind of Christianization does this strike you as? Does it seem authentic?
No.
No, that's not a trick question. No. The words I used, compel, fire, sword, defeat, kill, these are not the words we like to associate with the history of Christian mission. And this is a story that gets repeated in almost every European, we could say people groups of people. There were no, nation states back then. But there he is, canonized and credited with the Christianization of Norway. So there's legitimate historical evidence to suggest that maybe Europe wasn't really that Christian to begin with. This is a very complicated story, but that gives you a picture of why we even ask this question as historians. Okay. We move on. Exceptions to European secularization. So this is the main narrative, that Europe is becoming secular, but is it the whole narrative? So, European exceptionalism. I say this because, as we've discussed many times, the world is actually becoming more religious, right? We've learned that in this class. The world's becoming more religious. In 1970, 40% of the world's Christians lived in Europe. In 2010, a quarter of the world's Christians lived in Europe. By 2020, 22% of the world's Christians will likely live in Europe. So the world is becoming more religious, but Europe is becoming less religious, right? So in that sense, Europe is the exception to the global trend. And I point this out because for so many years throughout the 20th century, everyone thought the world was going to go the way of Europe. Europe was becoming less religious, and everyone thought the whole world was going to become less religious too. But actually, Europe is the outlier, and the whole world is actually becoming more religious. So looking at these exceptions to European exceptionalism is Eastern Europe. So everyone talks about this narrative of European decline, European secularization, when here's the map of Eastern Europe in 2010. And we've seen these kinds of maps before, the darker the blue, the greater the Christian. This is a pretty blue map. So Eastern Europe has experienced a great revival of Christianity since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And this is, of course, Orthodox Christianity. The non-religious are declining and Christians are increasing. And nearly every country in Eastern Europe, I would say every country in Eastern Europe, is now majority Christian. Here's a table. You know how we love numbers in this class. Let's look at Western Europe, so these green. So this is a table of the regions of Europe and then Europe as a whole. So the green, I highlighted here, this is the hard number of Christians in Western Europe, 148. 130, 126. So we see the decline happening in Western Europe, both by whole number and by percentage, and by a lot by percentage, by the way. 88 to 69, that's a huge drop. So we see this decline narrative happening in Western Europe, but then we see the reverse of that in Eastern Europe. In 1970, 57% of Eastern Europe was Christian. By 2010, 84, and by 2020, 85, maybe even more. And then maybe these losses and gains are offset a little bit, because look at the number of Christians in Europe in 2010 and 2020, it's nearly the same. Yeah, Chris?
Just about European birth rates, is that factoring in quite a bit of immigration?
Yep, that's the next slide.
Okay,
yeah, that's good.
Sorry.
That's good. You're thinking about how we think in this class. Why is this happening? What's the story behind the numbers? It's good. So Europe is transitioning from high birth rates and death rates, meaning they had lots of babies, but they also had lots of people dying, to low birth rates and low death rates, so not a lot of babies being born, and people are living longer. So this is called a demographic transition. This means in Europe that birth rates are below replacement level. I think we've talked about this. Roughly 2 children per woman is replacement level in order for your people to continue. Okay, so here's what's happening in some countries in Europe. Here's 1970 and then 2002. This is children per woman, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5. This is replacement level birth rates. So that's 2.1. So most were above in 1970, but over the course of these decades, you see the birth rates dropping and dropping and dropping. And let me go out on a limb and say these are Christian babies, because Europe is majority Christian. So it's really, remember we talked about how babies rule the world? Okay, it's true here too. That the fewer children are being born to Christians, and so that's going to impact your Christian demography. So over this time, 1970 and 2002, the countries here are France, Germany, Spain, Sweden, and Poland have declined in the number of children per woman. Now there's all kinds of reasons about why this is the case. A lot of it has to do with changes in values, decreasing church influence on public life, and these are also not just social challenges, but they're theological questions too. So what are the theological implications of women entering the workforce, of having fewer children, of wanting to take vacations and buy houses, and there are theological components to all of these issues too. Here's another way of looking at it, Europe in global perspective. So here's 1950, looking forward to 2050, and these are populations of continents, and then the world is up here. So you see Asia has the most people. The Africa line, the population is shooting up. Latin America, Northern America, they're all going like this, except for Europe, which is doing this. So Europe is the exception to the global trend. That's the point I'm trying to drive home. It's the exception population-wise, it's the exception religiously, it's becoming less religious, fewer people. So then what do we do about this? So European leaders, church leaders, and political leaders have been thinking about this issue for many years, because look, the trend started a while ago. And so one thing they thought was Europe needs immigrants. What do you do if your population can't sustain itself? Well, you need new people in your population to grow it. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go forward, especially when we get to Muslims in Europe. Okay, the last exception to European exceptionalism. Roma people, also known as gypsies. Gypsies tends to be a more pejorative term that is falling out of fashion. Here's a map. There's 7 million Roma people throughout Europe. And the darker the green, the greater the populations, also the size of the wheel. This wheel here, the Roma chakra, does that word sound familiar to you from another religion? Yeah, from Hinduism. So this symbol was actually borrowed, this is a total side note, was borrowed from Hinduism to signify Roma people's Indian heritage. And it also symbolizes, Roma people were highly transitory, and they traveled on wagons, and so the wheel is kind of like the wheel of a wagon. So this became kind of the official symbol of the Roma people. Now, we're talking about decline, decline, decline. Well, here's an example of a Pentecostal revival happening in Europe among the Roma people. So in 1950, a pastor begins to evangelize the Roma people in France, believing that they were part of God's chosen people. Does anyone know why he would think that Roma are God's chosen people along with the Jews?
Because they don't have a real home.
That is really good, actually. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yep, that's one reason. Another reason is because the Roma were persecuted in the Holocaust, just like the Jews. Yeah, so there were a few Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, Roma, and Jews, and other people were persecuted in the Holocaust. So he starts to evangelize, and a Pentecostal revival breaks out among Roma. In 1980, another revival called the Light and Life movement starts in the UK. And so now there's this Pentecostalism, which is typically not friendly to the European environment, by the way. Pentecostalism doesn't grow very quickly in Europe, but it has among the Roma people. And just like in many other kinds of Pentecostalism, there's emphasis on miracles, full immersion baptism, literal interpretations of the scripture. One major difference is that they don't allow women to be leaders, whereas many other Pentecostal churches do. So that's a difference in Romani Pentecostalism. It also has a very close relationship to Roma culture. And this is what we've seen about Pentecostalism, is that it absorbs culture and it's highly adaptable. That's why it's growing all over the place. So it forbids fortune telling, which is a very prominent Roma practice. Forbids drinking, smoking, forbids arranged marriage. These are not things that we tend to think about in terms of USA Pentecostalism, arranged marriage. Their kind of Pentecostalism says that Roma people have to follow the laws of the state. Because historically, Roma people didn't follow the laws of the state. They were kind of outlaws traveling around Europe. They were kind of stateless people. But now the Pentecostal movement is saying, you have to follow the laws. And they also kept a lot of they kept the Romani language and kind of the joyfulness and colorfulness of the Roma people. So I actually have a little bit of Romani worship music to share with you. Different style. If you want to be soothed by Romani language Pentecostal worship. So I just want to point out Spain here. So I have a friend who was a missionary in Spain for many years, and we talk about Spain as having this declining religious influence, and he would tell people that he is a Christian, and they would say, that's funny, you don't look like a gypsy, because Christianity is so prevalent among the Roma gypsy population that they think, oh, only gypsies are Christians. Like, how could this person be a Christian? So it's changing the way it's thought about. Okay, changes in European Christianity. This is where we're at now. So the percent of Europe that is Roman Catholic, in 1970, 39%, down to 37, and then declining. Now, one thing that people thought when Pope Francis got elected, they thought he was going to turn upside down the whole Roman Catholic Church, kind of a Jesus and the turning over the tables kind of way. You know, he's a different kind of pope. He puts spotlights on social issues, which maybe a lot of Europeans might care about. homosexuality, divorce and remarriage, abortion, immigration, poverty. They thought this was going to be the Pope that maybe could revive Catholicism in Europe. And so it was a big question, and maybe still is a big question, what does the election of the first Latin American head of the Roman Catholic Church mean for European Roman Catholicism? And I was thinking about this today, and I'm not actually sure I've seen much of an impact on European Roman Catholicism by the fact that they have a Latin American Pope, because most of the officials in Europe don't like him. So I think that people were hopeful that he might elicit some change and maybe some revival in the Roman Catholic Church, but I'm not quite sure it's happened. So this is still an open question, but I haven't seen any change so far. So just as you go about your life, think about this, about Pope Francis and the Roman Catholic Church in Europe. So that's maybe not a changes in European Christianity, but a change that was hoped for in European Roman Catholicism. This is an actual change. So mission from Protestant, Pentecostal, and independent churches in the global south, in particular Africa, going to Europe. Now we've talked about this reverse mission, mission from everywhere to everywhere before. And so when these missionaries from Africa arrived in Europe, many of them were utterly shocked at the status of Christianity in the former colonial masters. And so some of the fastest growing churches in Europe are migrant churches. And the arrival of African missionaries to Europe is really transforming Europe from a missionary sending continent to a missionary receiving continent. Now there are still missionaries sent from Europe, predominantly Roman Catholic, but now it's receiving an influx of missionaries in a new way. Anyone know who this guy is? You know who this guy is.
Yeah, but I'm blanking on his name.
Oh, sorry. I mean our Nigerian brother behind you. Can you tell us who it is?
So? His
Yeah.
name?
Yeah, tell us his name.
His name is
Sunday. Yeah.
Sunday.
Sunday Adelaja.
There you go. Yep, Sunday Adelaja. So Sunday Adelaja is a Nigerian preacher who arrived in Kiev, Ukraine about 30 years ago and built the Embassy of the Blessed Kingdom of God for All Nations. I just love independent Pentecostal church names. They're just always really grandiose. And so this was the largest church in Kiev, founded by a Nigerian preacher. And there are 40 congregations of this church in Kiev and 400 throughout Ukraine. Now, sadly, Pastor Sunday has faced a lot of controversy in his pastoring, a lot of financial controversy around adultery. So he actually went back to Nigeria last year in kind of a blaze of glory. So not always a positive story, but this is happening, this movement from Africa to Europe. Now let's look at Italy in particular. 20% of all foreigners in Italy are Africans. And here's two maps here. One of Ghanaian immigrants in Italy, and one of Church of the Pentecost branches in Italy. So this is a Nigerian Pentecostal denomination. Look at these dots. They're all over. Now when you think about Christianity in Italy, I doubt that you think about African Pentecostalism. But this is the new face of Christianity in Europe. Now a sociologist named Annalisa Buttici did the fieldwork to figure this out, of where these African Pentecostals are going. It's astounding, really. And so this has potential for changing the face of Christianity in Europe. Now what remains to be seen is how well accepted these churches are, because in Italy in particular there's obviously a very strong Roman Catholic heritage, and many of these churches are not considered real churches by most Italians. So are these churches full of Italians, or are they full of other African immigrants? They're mostly full of other African immigrants. So, but it's happening. These churches are being planted. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is Muslims in Europe. So this is pretty controversial these days. We've had some pretty high-profile terrorist attacks related to Islamic fundamentalism in Europe, and it's causing some fear, I think, among many people. And this is probably one of the topics I get asked about the most in my work. Yes, the Muslim population in Europe is growing. So here is a graph, and in the red box is the Europe data. And this is the change between 1910 and 2010, and this is the change between 2000 and 2010. So kind of the long-term change and then the short-term. And this shows you the growth of the Muslim population versus the growth of the general population. You see those red lines? So who's growing faster? Muslims, by a lot. So here's Northern Europe. Muslims grew at 8% per year. Remember how we talked about growth rates? Normally populations grow at about 2% per year, so 8%, that's astounding. And then look at the general population growth. Remember also how we talked about if you have growth under 1%, that's not growth. So all these numbers are under 1%, meaning the general European population is not growing, and the Muslims are growing at astounding rates. Now that growth has slowed over the more contemporary period, but Muslims are still growing faster than the general population. But I want to say not at crisis proportions. Again, I don't want to add any fear to this reality that Muslims are coming to Europe. So Europe is not becoming a Muslim nation or a Muslim continent, but the Muslim minority is important, and it also gets a disproportionate amount of the publicity and the news. Yes, it's true that Muslims have a higher fertility rate than the indigenous populations, but Muslim fertility rates also drop when they move from Muslim majority countries to European countries. You can't afford to have 7 children per woman in France like you can in some other places. Here's a graph from 2010 to 2016 that shows the number of first-time asylum seekers. So this is the reason that Islam is growing so quickly in Europe, is because of asylum seekers. And it shows here that the height is in 2015. This is really recent data, 2010 to 2016. The size of the circle tells you how many were arriving, and the number tells you what percentage were Muslims. So of the asylum seekers to Germany in 2015, 77% were Muslim. In Sweden, 75% were Muslim. In Hungary and Bulgaria, 93% were Muslim. So most of the asylum seekers coming into Europe are predominantly Muslim. But we also see it dropping off a little bit. So it remains to be seen what will happen in the Middle East and how it will impact the rise of the Muslim population in Europe. In 2015, the number of asylum seekers exceeded 1 million. It's pretty astounding to have 1 million people. Now this is challenging all kinds of things in Europe. National identity, religious identity. So all these European countries that like to say, oh, we're post-Christian, now we're secular, we have secular ideals. But then when you have an influx of Muslims, all of a sudden, but we're a Christian nation. Right? And so there's been this spike of xenophobia in Europe related to the influx of Muslim refugees. And this is a problem for the churches. Churches that are encouraged to welcome the stranger and to be in good relationship with your neighbors. This is a theological problem that the church needs to be a part of the solution. And then this just quickly, I'll show the changes in the Muslim population from 2010 to 2015. Even just in a 5-year period, you can see the darker green, meaning the higher concentration of Muslims. So this is a very prevalent issue in European society that the churches, I think, need to be a part of the solution. So as we move into our discussion groups to end our class, I just put a few things up here related to our discussion. Reflecting on secularization, and how does the secularization that we see in Europe compare and contrast to what we're seeing in the United States. We talked a little bit about some of the differences, but what's different, what's the same? This issue of immigrant integration, we hear about this a lot in the news, so in your groups you can talk about how churches can be a part of that discussion. And then where European Christianity fits in the global whole. So after hearing everything that we've heard in this class so far about changes in Christianity in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and the decline of the Christian West, what does the Christian West do now? Where does Europe actually fit? So for the rest of our class, we'll get into our small groups, and we'll discuss these and come back together at the end and see what your ideas are. Okay, let's break.